So Trase is an independent supply chain research initiative, right? And what that means is that we have mapped the supply chains of deforestation risk commodities from the places where they're grown, things like soy or beef, through to the companies that handle the export and ultimately to consumers, often on the other side of the world. And this is really revolutionary because we make this information available. So we have a web portal where anyone can go and they can see this data for themselves. They can download it or they can visualize the flows of beef from Brazil, from specific regions, all the way through to the countries that consume it. We want to bridge that gap. We want to make information available so that people know and they can make more informed choices as consumers or as governments or as companies managing these supply chains. Brazil is home to more than 200 million cattle. And every year they produce about 10 million tons of carcass. So that's meat on the bone, of which 20% is exported. Brazil is the world's largest cattle exporter. And it makes an enormous contribution to the Brazilian economy. Right? This is really important. It's just people herding cattle is 7% of Brazil's GDP. Despite all those positive economic benefits, the sector does have a darker side. There are still social impacts of cattle ranching which are negative. There are cases of slave labor, and there's land grabbing, even the displacement of traditional communities as cattle ranching expands in the frontier regions in the Amazon and the Sahara. This expansion also has a really large environmental impact. So 1/5 of all deforestation for commodities in the tropics is linked to Brazilian cattle ranching, just this one sector in this one country. These forests, these lands that are cleared, they are home to a wealth of biodiversity. They generate rainfall, they provide a lot of forestry products, and ultimately they store an enormous amount of carbon. But actually, if you add up the deforestation linked to cattle ranching, and also the greenhouse gas emissions that cows actually emit themselves when they digest grass, cattle ranching alone is half of all the greenhouse gas emissions for the entire Brazilian economy. Two-thirds of deforested land in the Amazon and in the Sahara ultimately becomes cattle pasture. But not all of this, in truth, is really caused by cattle ranching per se. So farmers who clear land because they want to raise more cattle. Actually, a portion of it is linked to insecure land tenure, so land speculation, because clearing land and then sowing grasses on it is one of the cheapest ways of gaining land. All that said, however, between 2015 and 2017, so over 3 years, about 14,000 square kilometers of deforestation was linked to cattle ranching expansion in Brazil. That's about 1.4 million football pitches. Despite this ongoing link between cattle ranching and deforestation and pasture expansion and deforestation, that link really can be broken. There's enormous potential to improve rural livelihoods by investing in agriculture and improving cattle ranching on lands that are already cleared. Brazil has an enormous area of pasture, which is quite inefficiently used. And studies show that we can easily treble the amount of cattle production on the lands that they already have, thereby increasing production, increasing rural revenues, but not expanding into forests, so breaking the link with deforestation. We use really detailed customs data for the export of deforestation risk commodities, in this case beef. Right? So we have information about the value, the volume, the contents of each shipment of beef or live cattle from Brazil, and we did it for 2015 to 2017. We link this data with other pieces of information on company assets, so where they operate slaughterhouses, and also where those slaughterhouses are licensed to export to. And what that allows us to do is triangulate the facility, which is the source of every single shipment of beef from Brazil. Now we know the slaughterhouse, but you have to identify, if you want to measure deforestation risk, where the cows came from, and link it to the deforestation in the places where the cattle were raised. To do that, we tie it together with animal movement data and government data on the origin of cattle slaughtered in export-approved slaughterhouses. So what that gives us is the location, the 3,000 municipalities in Brazil where cattle are being raised and deforestation is happening, linked back to the slaughterhouse and ultimately to each individual shipment and country that buys the beef. So in an ideal world, we would map commodities back to the specific farms where deforestation is or is not happening. That simply isn't possible on the scale of a country like Brazil. There are no property level maps available which can be linked to supply chain data. So what we do is we take a sort of intermediate step where we map supply chains back to districts and municipalities. This was already an enormous increase in resolution over what was available before. It's really revolutionary. That means that we end up calling deforestation risk rather than deforestation. In mapping the risks at the landscape level, we think we capture the real risks of those supply chains in a very accurate way. However, at the end of it, we call it deforestation risk to reflect that we had to aggregate property level deforestation to the municipal level and linking it to companies. So we mapped 98% of Brazil's beef and live cattle exports for 3 years, from 2015, 2016, and 2017. We identified the origin of the cattle that were ultimately slaughtered and then their beef products exported. So we tracked down the municipalities, the districts where the cattle came from, and linked it to 200 plus companies which export beef from Brazil, and then trace it all the way through to the 150 international markets which buy that beef. Close to a third of Brazilian beef products end up in China and Hong Kong. There's another 20% which goes to major halal markets, so Egypt, Lebanon, UAE, the United Arab Emirates. There's another 12% which goes to the EU, 9% to other countries in Latin America, about 5% to the United States, and the rest to the rest of the world. And in doing so, we identified about 75,000 hectares of deforestation risk linked to beef exports each year. There are more than 200 companies which export beef and live cattle from Brazil. But actually, 3 of those, JBS, Marfrig, and Minerva, cover about 2/3 of exports. And in fact, the sector is even more consolidated than that. Those companies have recently been expanding, buying up rivals. They're linked actually to the top 7 cattle exporting companies, and these together export about 80% of beef products. Trase is different from other initiatives in 4 main ways. First of all, we offering really high resolution trade data. Previously, if you wanted to know about Brazilian beef exports, you only knew that Brazil was exporting to such and such country. But now we break it down into where in Brazil those exports came from, which companies handle the exports, and which countries buy it. Second, we offer an enormous increase in scope. Right? We map the deforestation risk of supply chains across the entire sector. Third, that information is actor-specific, right? So we name the companies and we name the countries involved, which again is really useful information for decision-making. We are an open access portal. So we want to enable actors wherever you sit in the supply chain to have a common base of information about products, where they come from, what risks are associated with them. And finally, we link that all together. We work together with actors across the supply chain to drive more sustainable commodity production. There are 2 main commitments that have been made in the Brazilian beef sector. So the first is something called the TAC. So these are the Terms of Adjustment of Conduct, and they are legally binding commitments by individual slaughterhouses in the Amazon to avoid buying beef from farms that have cleared forest illegally. The second is something called the G4. This is a commitment by Greenpeace and then the 3 largest meatpacking companies, so JBS, Minerva, and Marfrig, who all also export. And they've committed to 0 deforestation, not just illegal. Now, the thing is, with the new Trase data, we identify more than 150,000 hectares of deforestation risk, which is actually linked to the exports of these 3 companies. So, why do we still see deforestation risk when these companies have made commitments? Part of the answer is that these companies only monitor their direct suppliers. They're not looking down the supply chain, actually, at the bulk of the problem, which are all the farms who sell cattle but are also associated with deforestation, which ultimately ends up in their supply chain. What we've been doing is we've included those indirect suppliers where the data allow, and that allows us to capture those risks more holistically. The second is that those commitments only apply to the Amazon. And what we see with the Trase data, which maps the deforestation risk across the Amazon and the Sahara, but maps beef sourcing from across the country, is that actually 45 to 60% of the deforestation risk linked to these three companies who've made a commitment is occurring outside the Amazon, in the Sahara, where cattle ranching is also expanding into forests and into savanna. What this suggests is that for these companies to eliminate deforestation in Brazilian beef exports or across their supply chains, they need to extend those commitments both beyond the Amazon to the rest of Brazil, but also beyond just the farms that they buy from directly, including all their indirect suppliers. Trase data is really powerful in the hands of a number of actors. First of all, the companies themselves and the investors looking at making investors across the agricultural sector, right, to identify hotspots of risk. So where is your company sourcing linked to deforestation, so that they can go on the ground, identify important places to engage with producers. It's also useful for engaging sort of the positive stories. So where has deforestation gone down? Where are commitments, zero deforestation commitments that some of these companies have made, where are they working? And Trase data can be used to evaluate that over time. Beyond companies, governments have a need for high-resolution trade data like this. There are 7 European countries who have made a commitment to have zero deforestation commodities. Germany, France, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Denmark, Norway, and Italy. For the first time, using Trase data, they're able to monitor the impact of that commitment. Are the changes that companies in those countries making having any impact on the ground and reducing the deforestation risk imported into those markets? Then, of course, there are NGOs, journalists, and investors, again, who can use this information to map risks, to link it to specific companies, and to monitor progress over time. We live in a digital age where consumers are used to having information about everything on their smartphone or whatever. But though food is such an important sector and industry, it's a big part of our lives, the whole food industry is lagging behind in providing information to consumers about where their food comes from and what the impacts are. And if that information isn't available, then to push for it. These companies just need a small nudge to disclose and to investigate better what the impact of the food that they sell is. We've just completed subnational beef, but first of all, it needs to be updated. So we want these data to be useful for people to monitor the progress, so how deforestation risk is changing over time. Secondly, we want to expand beyond Brazil. We have now subnational data on Brazilian beef, Paraguayan beef, but we want to cover beef from across Latin America, and ultimately Trase has the goal of covering 70% of deforestation risk commodities by 2021. And lastly, back in Brazil, exports are responsible for about 20% of the Brazilian market. There's still that 80% which is eaten by Brazilian consumers, and we're going to have a go at mapping the Brazilian supply chains as well.